I'm Dan Smolin. I built a successful executive career in marketing and communications before becoming a top headhunter and founding my own executive search firm. Now get this, every day, mainstream media runs stories in which old school bosses and thought leaders frame your work and workplace issues in ways that are often divisive and unmeaningful. And that's just crazy. The time has come for you to answer the question, what's your work fit, so that your work and career fit who you are, how you want to live, and what you want your lasting contributions to be. What's your work fit? It answers your questions and tackles the issues that keep you up at night about advancing your career in this time of workplace revolution. So let's get started. Hey, good day, everyone. Dan Smolin from What's Your Work Fit. Happy 2025. We are excited about starting our spring 2025 season of live shows. We've got 11 of them in a row. No breaks. Let's see if it breaks me. Anyway, we're really excited about it. And we're particularly excited about this community called What's Your Work Fit that we have built over the last 3 years. It is absolutely amazing. And what I enjoy most about it is how the learning around future of work and what I am increasingly calling modern work, and also the workplace where it all happens, has evolved. It's happened by the week, and it's been absolutely fascinating. So if you are a regular viewer of this live show, thank you for your support. If you're new to the platform, let me introduce you to some of the ways that you can engage. We are on LinkedIn and YouTube. This is where we live stream our shows. So you can choose one or the other or both. I prefer both. And the reason is that if you become part of the YouTube page, looking at our library of past video, full shows and clips is very, very easy. Furthermore, we're now on Substack. What's Your Work Fit is now on Substack. And this is a really nice destination to read up on the posts that we put up, watch live and recorded shows that we have, and video clips. And also, this is a new destination for our audio podcasts. So check that out. We're at dansmolin.substack.com. One other message, and that is, if you like what you are experiencing here on What's Your Work Fit, please tell 5 of your friends to subscribe on the platforms of their choice here at What's Your Work Fit. Okay, we have a great show ahead, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our guest today. He is Gabe Marins. How you doing, Gabe?
Hey, Dan. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Gabe is the vice chairman of the commercial real estate leader Savills. He's based in Manhattan. He is also the host of 60 Seconds with Gabe, which is a nice, short, but compelling video series on LinkedIn and on YouTube that addresses key issues around real estate and workplace utilization. Well done. Well done, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I wish it was a stroke of genius. It was pretty straightforward. 60 seconds. When I introduced the series was the limit of videos on Instagram. So I figured that was the limit at the time of the human attention span. That since has shortened, but at the time it worked quite well.
Well, it's fantastic. And we will, in our show notes for this episode, include links so that people can watch them. Let me introduce our co-host today. First up, Mark Gilbreath, CEO of LiquidSpace. How are you, Mark? Good to see you.
I'm well. Happy New Year, viewers, and welcome, Gabe. Great to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
And also Fran Saele, who is the managing principal at Mortevita. How you doing, Fran?
Great, Dan. Great to be with you, and also Mark and Gabe. Great to finally be able to interact live with you as opposed to exchanging stuff on LinkedIn and elsewhere.
Yeah, I feel very very special that I was invited into this clubhouse. So I'm excited for our conversation here today, and who knows which direction it's going to go in, but I'm here for the ride.
Well, that's the really fun part about it. I want to get right to our lead question here, which we're eager to ask you. We'll get right to it. Gabe, we want to know, what are workplace tenants looking for today?
So I could take the easy way out and give you the short answer, which is an amenitized workspace. But that would be selling, I think, the reality on the ground short. And while it's not incorrect, the true answer is longer and far more nuanced. And so what I'm actually going to give as the straightforward answer is essentially the unicorn that is hard to capture within a workplace, but that is a mission-driven culture. And I say this because very simply stated, you have examples, and we've got clients that are in the equivalent of the Palo Alto garage in New York City. E-class buildings with maybe half of a side of light that are in the office 5 days a week for 12 hours plus a day. These are not buildings that have a lot of amenities. These are places where people are gathering to work, and what's driving them is this mission, this shared mission, which of course feeds into this culture. On the other hand, you have some of the nicest buildings in the city that are also having employees report to work 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, these are larger businesses and larger companies, and there's a bit of a mandate associated with that return to work. And so amenities are nice to have, but what's truly driving this market is this shared sense of mission, and ultimately how that translates into a strong culture.
Fran, you got the first question. Take it away.
Thanks, Dan. Gabe, let's pick up on that whole issue of where people are working and why they're working together, and the whole issue, the whole concept of distributed work and how that impacts on today's office environment. You indicated that people are working in all different kinds of environments in offices. And yet, when we look at information and stuff that we're doing out at Stanford with Nick Bloom and others, the stats say that, based on a number of criteria, that about 30%, 30% of all knowledge work today is still done somewhere outside of an office, and that's most likely home or other places. People are finding it difficult to figure out what actual occupancy of offices really is. You can look at lights at night, but that doesn't necessarily give you a good answer. And the data on that is very, very weak. There are a couple of services that provide it, but there's not a lot of faith in the fact that they're giving accurate information on a broad basis. What's your take on that question, and how does that impact your market, particularly in New York and elsewhere?
So I am not an evangelist for 5 days a week in the office. I am a tenant rep office broker. My living and my ability to pay my mortgage is, of course, tied into the leasing of office space. But I think that we are looking at this whole situation, Fran, as you've described this, in a bit of an inverted way. So I'll elaborate on that.
Okay.
The question of occupancy is a red herring, in my view. There's no other real estate asset class that we gauge from an occupancy standpoint. Retail, residential, we don't think about the efficiency or efficacy of an apartment based on how often it's used. We don't think about retail in terms of how often it's occupied. If we use that logic, then restaurants would be an absolute waste. Industrial in much the same way. Each of these asset classes serves a very specific role, and the office serves different roles for different organizations and for different people within those organizations. And part of the confusion right now is that it's no longer a bipolar environment where you're either remote or in the office. We are coming out of this environment where we had something called hybrid, which existed before. We've just found a new way of describing it. And so, if I were to be pegged down to what is the optimal time in the week to be in the office, well, I'd have to better understand exactly what that role is. For some people, it's 1 day a week. Other people, it's 3, and still others, it's 5. And when we very publicly were clued into Jamie Dimon's private comments about work at JP Morgan Chase from a couple of weeks ago, I think the overwhelming emotional sentiment that a casual listener could pick up was frustration, and it was frustration with an employee base that he perceived to have taken advantage of the system, that he was the one coming into the office and he can't reach people on Fridays, and they were paying people to be available and to work, and that just wasn't happening. All of which goes to say that might work for JP Morgan, where there has to be a bit more accountability, hence the mandate to be in the office 5 days a week. But with some of the businesses that I was referencing earlier, the smaller mission-driven companies, they're not operating with a 5-day-a-week mandate. That's just kind of happening. And so, I've touched on a couple of things here, Fran, but I'm not of the belief that 5 days a week is going to work for everybody. And you're seeing some very large employers that continue to remain dedicated to the idea of remote work. And I think that's really healthy and good for the overall workforce to have options available to them. Some of the best and most attractive employees out there, they should be able to demand what they want in terms of their work fit. And for many of those, that means a remote job. And so I'm not of the belief that those should disappear, but I think there is this very definitive trend back to the office, back to more top-down accountability. And I think it would be silly for us to ignore. Now, one final point, and I love Nick Bloom's stuff. His data by necessity is going to be backwards looking. Our data is going to be less data focused and more anecdotal about reporting what we're seeing from the front lines and sharing what we're hearing from the executive class, who we primarily deal with when we're talking about site search and real estate advisory. So, I would imagine that those two lines would converge at some point. I just don't know how further ahead we are than him, or if those lines and the data sets that we're kind of playing in are truly the same.
Well, it's certainly difficult to forecast today, given all the change occurring everywhere. Everything we touch today is different, so it's an issue. But with respect to occupancy, I think a lot of occupiers are looking at their existing space that they leased 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and the data does show that as these occupiers are renewing, that on average they're taking either they're leaving the buildings they're in, or they're reducing their footprint by 15-20%, almost across the board. Maybe that's not true for all occupiers, but I think that would suggest that occupiers are thinking of how well they're using the space. They still may have the same need for spaces for employees to gather at various times, but now they think, well, maybe they need a little less because they're doing other things at various times of the day. Is that how you figure that component into a client's desire for? How do you help clients to decide how to pick a footprint going forward?
Yeah, this is a significant part of what we help our clients do. And there does seem to be a disagreement in the data. So I've seen the same information that you're sharing about this trend lines of reduction in office space. At the same time, I think if you really dove into the data and segmented it by tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities, I think you would start to see some differentiation. Furthermore, I do think that there's a difference between size of companies. And lastly, what I'd say is that while it sounds like a convenient talking point, the square footage per employee from a planning perspective has gone up. So let's dial it back to 2019. 2019, you were essentially planning for 2 employee spaces. You were planning for their specific workspace, so their cubicle, their benching, their office, and then a conference facility that they would use to meet with their fellow on-site employees. You fast forward 6 years, and now you're at the minimum planning for 4 different kinds of spaces for that same employee. You're still planning for their individual workspace. In the US, there's still a 1-to-1 ratio of employee to workspace. It is culturally sticky. It is different outside of the US. The UK, for example, has more fully embraced hoteling as a concept. The US, New York in particular, has not. Again, there are exceptions to the rule, but as a general rule, that's the case. You're also still planning on conference space for on-site employees to meet. But now you're also planning for more of a phone booth environment for them to take Zoom calls in a way that's not distracting their fellow employees. And then you're also planning for soft seating or kind of living room type spaces for them to engage with. And sometimes that's picked up by amenities within the building, or other times that amenity segment, so rooftop space, terrace space, that could be its own fifth separate category. And you've seen this where we've slid from about 200 square feet per employee, and we're trending in some cases north of 300 square feet per employee as a result of that. Now, in cases where, sorry, Fran, in cases, I'll finish with this final thought. In cases where you're seeing some employees or employers shrink their square footage, that doesn't mean everything that I just shared relates to on-site employees. They are able to sometimes still achieve all of that and still reduce their square footage by redesignating certain employees as more remote, segmenting a portion of their employee workforce as hoteling. So it could be 20% as opposed to what it might have been 10% before, or assigning them to other lower cost regions like Nashville or even Austin in a way that helps them save money. And those cities are areas that engage with the real estate a little bit differently.
No questions. Lots of moving parts in that programming. It's difficult today.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. Lots of provocative bits in there. Maybe if I could start at a high level, how much office is too much? It seems, or we certainly are hearing, that many companies are still grappling with how much space they actually need, with a perspective that they need less than they had. But it sounds like, if I interpret your comments correctly, that Savills' posture or point of view is, no, you probably need more. You maybe thought you needed 200 a person before. You probably need more. Am I hearing that right? And is the advice and outlook that office absorption will increase and surpass the prior norms?
Definitely not hearing that. So the idea that employers need more space than they do before might be true on an individual level, but many of these companies that are now coming towards the end of their 5 or 10-year lease terms have designed space in a way that is inefficient. And there's a lot of wasted space. And there's a lot of spaces that might have been designed in a way that is not just equipped to deal with the way the current workforce is working. And the classic example here is the old school legal library that's just not needed. Or if you're a tech company, a very large data room, which again is not needed. And so when you're redesigning the spaces, there's a recapture of spaces that have just been antiquated given the pace of technology change. And so it doesn't translate necessarily into a larger footprint. When you see companies taking more space, it is not being driven by a need for more square footage per employee. That is being driven by more employees that they're trying to house, as opposed to more square footage per employee.
Clear. And thank you. Maybe as a follow-up, picking up on your comment with regards to asset classes, real estate asset classes, and the principle of efficiency or revenue or utilization per foot. I think the data does show, and a lot of anecdotes and an increasing amount of sort of public stories show that in the years since the pandemic, one of, if not one of the few categories of commercial real estate, office real estate that actually had expansion was flexible office, co-working and all of its other variants, which with the exception of the year 2020, actually has expanded both in uptake as well as scale. And I know from our work with that community that most of those operators and most of the customers that utilize flexible office both look at the efficiencies of that type of asset class. And for the operators in particular, whether it's large players like Industrious or small local operators, which are numerous in New York, they draw a lot of inspiration from the hospitality industry. And I bring that up because, I'm sure you do know, the hotel world, the Marriotts of the world, they obsess over RevPAR, revenue per available room. I mean, they are hyper focused on, utilization and as measured by revenue production on a unit basis. And so, what are Savills' thoughts with regards to the merits of flexible office from a financial efficiency standpoint, and how are you seeing that play in the workplace strategies of the clients that you're serving traditional space to?
I don't think there's enough flexible space out there. I think that there is a demand for all of the things that you just described that are associated with flexible office. So in addition to the typical offerings, which is short-term, low CapEx, the ability to more flexibly plan both up and down, as well as the hospitality first approach that I think flexible space has really brought in. And I give WeWork a lot of credit for doing that. But Industrious, I think, in many instances has kind of reestablished that as the gold standard. But there are others who do it equally well, if not better. There's just not as much of a supply, particularly in a place like New York, in a way that's very clearly impacting the broader market. So I am long on flex space. I think there's a insane supply crunch, again, in New York, across the US. I think that is a reflection of some of the restructuring that the second largest flex provider has gone through in 2024. And I'd like to see a lot more of it be introduced. And so I'm a big cheerleader for the industry, and we utilize it very thoughtfully as one of our strategic levers when we're advising our clients on real estate, because it doesn't always make sense. Now, on a per square foot basis, typically flex space will be more expensive, which makes sense because all the costs are bundled into a single line item. And yet at the same time, you should also be paying up, as I describe it, as almost a insurance premium for having that short-term flexibility that you might not otherwise get elsewhere. And so during COVID, we helped many of our clients transition from traditional office to flex, and we continue to do so strategically. I'm a big fan of it as an industry. I'd like to see more of it. And everything you just shared, I don't know if you were expecting this answer, I agree with.
Yeah, super. Thanks, Gabe.
So, Gabe, our viewers do their homework, and Avner read your post today, and he says, Gabe, you wrote a post in which you said Long Island City gets a bad rap. So, how do you overcome client objections to workplace properties that aren't in the 212 area code? And I should mention, you've got Park Avenue and 53rd Street behind you, which is like one of my favorite places in Manhattan. So how do you create a value proposition for a client who maybe is price sensitive to look at Long Island City and perhaps other outer borough properties?
So this is where the consultant hat is placed firmly on our head, because we have to get into the minds of our clients and make decisions, or help them make decisions that are in their own best interests as opposed to our biases. When I started in the business, it was white shirt, tie, and dark suit with lace-up shoes every day. And as you can tell, you can't see my bottom half, but I am not in a white shirt, suit, and tie with lace-up shoes. And so what I'd say is, and we've done quite a number of transactions in Long Island City. Long Island City is an amazing option for the right kind of user. One of the things that the 212 or Manhattan does not have is industrial space or mixed use space. And Long Island City does have that. Long Island City does have amazing central location for mass transit. Long Island City is easier and faster to get to for commuters out of Long Island proper, as opposed to other parts of the city and the tri-state area. Long Island City also, along with other parts of Manhattan, are recognized by our city government as sometimes needing a little bit of a boost. And so there are incentives, significant as of right incentives that are available for employers that bring jobs to these areas. And so for a tech company that's trying to recruit 20-something-year-old engineers, Long Island City might not be the best option. But if you are a photo studio and you need large spaces with high ceilings with tons of natural light and parking, Long Island City is going to be an area that you're going to want to think about very seriously.
It's not office space, but I remember from my working days in Midtown Manhattan that Silver Cup Studios over in Long Island City got launched, and there's a lot of TV and movie production happening there.
It's it's a big creative hub.
So you mentioned younger workers, and I know from talking to my friends over at Morgan Stanley who work with clients and like to have their young up and comers in the same room with them as they are having client engagement, because that's how they believe soft skills are learned. A lot of their talent comes out of Suffolk County, Long Island, and maybe on a train up to 4 hours each day. That's for a young up and comer. I could see where they'll do that to a point, but maybe they're not going to travel in that far, and maybe they'll get lucky. Maybe they can move closer in, but if they can't, maybe that job becomes less and less attractive over time. Have you in your work heard of any ideation with clients who are really committed to having co-located work 3 or 4 times a week and want their people close by, to maybe create a tie-in with a hospitality, with a hotel chain perhaps, to create a nearby campus so that people can, who are new to the job, can work close by, perhaps work longer at the co-location, and then go home to the hospitality unit 2, 3, 4 days a week. Is there any kind of creative thinking around those kinds of arrangements, Gabe?
So the answer is yes. There's a lot of brain power spent trying to address this and acknowledge it. And I have yet, though, to be exposed to anything more than higher compensation. The single biggest benefit to certainly younger employees, if they're finding it challenging to live close to work, is if it's too expensive, well, then increase their compensation. So you do see that in terms of higher relocation budgets. You do see that in terms of higher compensation. But if we're talking about a 4-hour commute, that can be very challenging. Now, I think that there's also a big focus on where in your life stage are you. So if you are young, single, living in Manhattan, that's a very different equation than if you are retired and downsizing and moving back to the city, which is a very different equation than the stage of life that I'm in, which is I have 3 young kids, and COVID was a godsend for me because it disrupted what was the rhythm. And there are vestiges of COVID that I hold on to very dearly, in particular Fridays as my work from home day. I often don't really see my kids Monday through Thursday. I'm in the office very early and I leave very late. If I can capture my Friday, that gives me 3 of the 7 days of the week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday with them. And that alleviates the guilt and allows me not to be a stranger to them. And so I think that it's this middle stage of life that I'm at that is the most challenging to convince people to go back to the office, because many who are at my peer level are established. They are not going to be benefiting from mentorship in the same level as someone who's 20 years earlier in their career. And the benefits are a little bit more abstract. You want to be on a leadership track or leading a team. And so it's a much harder argument to make. And so you can imagine my conversations at home with my peer set don't really go anywhere, because there's a very strong allegiance to this way of life that they've taken out of COVID. And I'm very sympathetic to it. But again, I think that it depends on people. I think the professional services world is a little bit more flexible in terms of carving out this work-life balance. So, it's a challenge to address. But if the issue is cost for housing and proximity to your place of work, the best way to address that is pay them more so they can afford to live closer to the office. Right.
Fran?
Gabe, this is a question I know you always wanted to receive from somebody. You've done 126 60-second with Gabe episodes, which are tremendous. I really enjoy those. And I learned something usually from your little blip. But in all that time, what question did you get where you wish you had more than 60 seconds to answer? And is this a good time for you to discuss that question and a good answer for this audience?
And you have more than a minute to answer.
Well, the reality is I think I go closer to 80 seconds. Once I have someone on and watching the countdown clock.
I do that.
And the one thing is I filmed 130 of them. I just haven't published them yet. So I do a little secret. I do batch film them. It makes it a little bit more efficient. It takes me about 10 minutes per episode for the writing, the filming, and the post-production. I've gotten it down to a science. But the general topic of questions that I get that I'd love to spend more time on is around leadership, is around my experiences in the business. And typically I tend not to focus on it because the series is more about reporting observations that we're seeing in the market, as opposed to really reflecting on leadership. I spend a lot of time reading biographies, political leaders, business leaders, military leaders, and I try to understand and identify mentors, non-fictional mentors, but people who I may not have met in person, to learn tips and tricks. And I think the big unifying element here is that people will mimic what they see. In other words, role models are the most effective leadership tool available to a leader. And so I try to be incredibly conscious of this. And even in this conversation, the last question about the need to have some sort of balance and be able to prioritize family, and it's not all about work. I'm obsessive about my work. I feel deeply passionate about it, but I'm very thoughtful about how I frame that and the choices that I make, because it's important to be well-rounded in life, and I want my team to understand that and embrace that, and also live a life that is in full color.
Great. It's a good answer. Good answer.
Yeah.
Mark?
Go ahead, Mark.
Gabe, data in CRE and workplace decision making. I'm dating myself, but 15 years ago at Cornet, in the futuristic breakout sessions or discussions, lots of talk then around this aspirational sort of future state where occupiers would be able to really understand the utilization of their workplaces. And broadly speaking, by and large, that utilization measurement and data insight challenge has been addressed. We've got a rich community of prop tech companies of all manner that provide various ways to get clarity on that aspect. And most occupiers, I think, and I would imagine in New York City in particular, are awash with data with regards to the utilization of their leased office footprint. But much of work is happening beyond that traditional office. Many companies, not all, many companies are also incorporating hybrid work policies, whether structured or not. Many companies are factoring in distributed work or even remote work. How are you seeing tenants, and how is Saele working with tenants in balancing kind of those complexities? The hard data of observable, sensible, fixed offices, with the soft data or the policy data or the data they don't have around where people might be when they're not there. How are occupiers sort of contending with that to come up with the right strategies as it relates to their workplace?
So I'm gonna answer your question with something that I learned when we started shopping for our house when we moved to the suburbs several years ago. And that is, you fall in love with a house and then you have to rationalize the decision. And I think that in many ways describes how companies decide about how they're going to utilize their office and their thoughtful approach to the office. Now, it's not the case for everybody, but generally speaking, the companies that have been earlier to returning to the office by mandate, so JP Morgan, Amazon, many others, when the reporters talk about the evolution of that position, it almost always stems from the C-suite. And then it falls to the real estate team to justify and validate. And there were attempts over the years to prove that workers are more efficient in the office. And I think it's a consensus view that that was not a proven data point. I think that most people who follow the data at best can say it's inconclusive, and at worst can say that there's no trend whatsoever. And others might say that you're even more productive outside the office. I think that there is some truth, however, to longevity within a workplace. that people who tend to be more remote might be shifting their job roles a little bit more often. But even there, correlation does not equal causation.
Right.
And it could very well be that these are workers that are more highly sought after, that are commanding higher salaries and compensation, and there are fewer of them out there. And therefore, these are the kinds of roles that people tend to jump around in. So I think it's very hard to draw a objectively true proof point, which is why this is such a fascinating area of study for so many. We are often engaged with real estate teams to try to prove a hypothesis, but very rarely are we the ones who are advancing it. Just the other day, someone asked us about, again, the productivity question, trying to draw a line around return to office with profitability within the stock market and the trading of the stock price. And up until 2 weeks ago, I think we would have seen an amazing correlation between return to office and stock performance. And then we've seen over the last 2 weeks, the bottom fall out of the stock market. And if we were to look at it today, we would see that return to office is apparently the worst thing you could do for some of these companies. So it's very hard to create this isolated environment and kind of pull the data. I think we've mentioned Nick a few times here. I think he does a really good job of it. I disagree with many of his observations, but the data that he presents, I'm not the data scientist, but the data that he presents is always thought-provoking.
So take a recently publicized example. Bloomberg had a feature piece in November or December, I think, profiling Allstate Insurance. And their CEO, who publicly fell out of love with his HQ. You mentioned falling in love with a house, and I fell in love. I can totally relate to the personal story, by the way, because I fell in love with a house. It ended up being, anyway, we fell in love with it. We rationalized it. We moved in. But back to Allstate, their CEO, the C-suite level, fell out of love with his headquarters and sold it, as a result of the pandemic, and did so, as he's spoken, for a couple of reasons. One, he observed the hard data that the office, that headquarters was not being utilized well. He also had the hard data or the insight that I think the number was 83% of teams across all states, sort of ground level functioning teams, had distributed members. And so the proposition of them being productive by coming together in an office location was sort of nonsensical, given that they had chosen great talent in a distributed fashion. And then as a byproduct of that decision, that feature piece from Bloomberg described how they had successfully reduced their real estate cost annually from, I think, $380 million to something like $125. They had a 70% reduction in real estate cost as a measure of ROI. While also celebrating the importance of gathering. I mean, this wasn't them refuting the value of place, but rather he fell out of the old way. He fell out of love with the old way that he thought about place. So do you think examples like that are the contrarian fringe, or are going to be temporary blips, and the long arc is going to be a return to something that Jamie Dimon would advocate for? Or do you expect that, motions like Allstate's are going to inspire others to follow? What's your crystal ball suggest to you?
I loved reading that article about Allstate. And I think that one of the things that we have lacked during this period, and we're finally starting to see real examples of that, is this promise that we would see this experimentation with how we're engaging with office space. Mm-hmm. I hope that it works for Allstate. And I think that the early data seems to indicate that it's going to. I mean, they were able to make their workforce more content. They were able to reduce costs, and they're able to differentiate as an employer within a tightening job market, although maybe not so tightening based on the data from last week. But all of those things would seem to point towards a smart business decision. And yet again, I think that's a great example of many of these decisions are made from the top down. This is one example where it was not a mandate to go to the office, but a reimagining of how you're engaging with the office. And there are yet other examples, Mark, like NVIDIA is very famously not insisting on a mandate to return to office for most of their white collar workforce. In fact, I don't believe that they even program one-to-one seats for their employees. And so, there are others who we could point to, and I'd like to see more of this, because the whole beauty of this multi-dynamic environment that is America is the fact that we should be offering different things to the global workforce. And part of that is also whether you have to go to work in an office or not. Amazon famously is insisting on 5 days a week to go to the office. That should be a choice. Jamie Dimon said, you walk with your feet. That should be a choice. And it's nice to see that there are other options out there should your choice be not to go back to the office 5 days a week.
Well said.
Right.
So you bring up Amazon, and we've got Amazon HQ2 here in Northern Virginia in Arlington, right by National Airport. That got envisioned and probably 1/3 to a halfway built pre-pandemic. But now that we've gone through the pandemic 5 years post, what's going to happen to visions like that? Is Amazon going to have to cut back on their completion vision for that big HQ2? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I don't know enough to comment directly on Amazon's HQ2, but I do love how this is just this constant pendulum that we find new ways of describing old trends. And Amazon is not the first company to establish an HQ2. I think they made a bit of a secretive reality show through the bidding process. But if you look at the workforce numbers, which I have not, but I'd imagine that Northern Virginia is not the number 2 concentration of Amazon workers across the U.S. I would venture a guess that maybe New York is, especially with the focus on AWS and their hiring trends and the like. There was a well-publicized deal that they just partnered up with WeWork here in New York, which is a nice confluence of several of the themes that we're talking about here. And so, do I know specifically about whether that's going to be completed or not? I don't. I know that I'm long New York. I think in this process of deglobalization, in this post-COVID world, the importance of a city like New York has only risen. And I think that's good for certainly this region, but I think it's good for the US as well, for a long number of reasons, which we don't even have enough time here to talk about. But the point is that I think that we'll continue to see bifurcation of operations. And again, that's a good thing for both the companies themselves as well as for their employee base.
So we're actually running out of time. We got a little bit time left. I've got one more question for you, and then our final question. And the one question that I have to you is about Gabe's leadership style with his team members, with the people that you lead. How has it evolved in particular? I know you are a very intentional leader, and you try to foster trust with your people. What things have evolved in your leadership style that you are most proud of?
I think it's what I would love for someone to call me eventually, but for now I just call myself it, and that's a performance coach. I am a leader officially of my team, but the way I see myself is a performance coach and on a deeply individualized basis. There are a lot of different shapes and sizes to brokers out there. You have the caricature of the alpha male pounding his gorilla chest at the top of the mountain. But you also have the model of the extraordinarily nerdy kid who just kind of puts in all the time and all of a sudden looks around and realizes that he's fallen in love with the business. And so there's not a single way of doing things. Yeah. And so I try to take my cues from my own experiences, and I try to use that to model how I treat my team. When I hire, I look for incredibly ambitious, highly competent people. I want to hire and train leaders who can in turn hire and train leaders. To me, that is the ultimate expression of success. If you can replicate in a different way, but replicate all the benefit that I've experienced from working at such an amazing place as Savills, New York. So I see myself as a performance coach. I've gotten better over the years of thinking about things not through my lens, but through the lens of whomever I'm trying to coach. It's a constant journey of getting better at it and putting others first. Having kids has been a great accelerant in allowing myself to do that. It's been deeply humbling, but so has everything in life. So I'm getting better at it. I've got a long way to go, but it's one of the most meaningful areas of my life, the ability to help contribute to people succeeding in their chosen careers and personal lives.
That's so wonderful. And oh, by the way, Glenn Ross is coming back to Broadway. You can go watch that and cringe, right, Gabe?
Yeah. Listen, the ABCs is really only good if you're watching it on Sesame Street.
Very good. I love that we're ending on this point. But before we get to our final question, I want to give you an opportunity to point our viewers and our audio podcast listeners to where they can find you on social media and perhaps how they can engage with you.
Yeah, I'm hard to miss if you look for me, but LinkedIn is where I reside most days of the week. So that's just my name, Gabe Marans. You can also find me on my website, gabemarans.com, and I have a YouTube channel as well. If you need my email, it's gmarans@savills.us, but that's a mouthful. But if you reach out to me on any of those platforms, I try my best. I have a personal rule that I try to get back to everybody within 12 to 24 hours. So if for whatever reason I don't get back to you, it's probably because there's a weird time zone change that I'm grappling with. But I will get back to you. I will see the message, and I appreciate the future reach outs.
And all those touch points will be in our show notes for this episode. One last question for you, Gabe, and it is one that we ask all our guests. And that is, what's your work fit? What attribute, condition, experience, place, or state of mind makes work a wonderful part of your day, doing many wonderful and meaningful things and not the all-consuming time suck of a day? What's your work fit?
I'm going to give you an abstract answer to this. And it ties back to a lot of what we talked about. I find that I am my best version of myself when I'm surrounded by smart, thoughtful, ambitious people. And that could be my team, which is a delight to show up to work every day and be surrounded by them. It could be with clients, that when I'm with clients that fit that description, I just feel like my game is elevated. It's with my friends, and it's also with my family. So when I find myself surrounded in that environment, I find that I've struck the ideal note for my work fit.
Absolutely brilliant. Gabe, this has been so much fun. I have one more question. Will you come back at some future point to continue the conversation?
Yeah,
I
love this, Dan. I really appreciate you inviting me on, and Fran, you get equal credit, and Mark. This conversation has been a delight, unexpected at times. It's been a lot that's been shared, your questions that have made me think about things a little bit differently. So I would love an encore if you'd have me, but this has been great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, gentlemen. We will be back next week. Take care.